Hello! Uh, I'm making this video to think about the different ways you can categorize poems. You might think that that's a silly thing to make a video about, and you might be right. I myself think sometimes, like, what is the good of putting poems into little categories? And I think that there is a real need or real use to doing so, because it lets us think about what poems we can write based on these different categorizations. Um, and I'm also making this video because when I took a poetry class in college, my professor in that class told us at this very first lesson that we took, she told us, can you think about what poetry is? And nobody could come up with a good definition. I now think that poetry is beauty manifested through language, but even that is a very nebulous definition that doesn't really mean anything. Um, so I think it's much more useful to think about concrete categories that you can put poems into. Um, and that can be a good launching pad for new poems. If you want to write poetry, you might try writing a poem in one of these categories. And that could be a good prompt. So I think the best place to start would be to think about why people read poems. And I think the main reason people read poems is because if poems are done right, they can sound very cool and fun and beautiful and just awesome. And you can put that all in one category of the entertaining poem. Uh, and notable subcategories of that category would be the story poem and also the fun poem. So I think a great story poem is Lewis Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter, which goes, "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We could do with more than four. We cannot do with more than four, excuse me, to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock, conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. "Now, Harry," said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the walrus said, "is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed." "But not on us," the oysters cried, turning a little blue. "After such a kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do." "The night is fine," the walrus said. "Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice." The carpenter said nothing but, "Cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice." "It seems a shame," the walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far, and made them trot so quick." The carpenter said nothing but, "The butter's spread too thick." "I weep for you," the walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. "Oh, oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd because they'd eaten every one. It's by, of course, Lewis Carroll. Um, and I think that's just so great. You can tell poems, or excuse me, you can tell stories with poems. And in fact, that's how stories used to be told. Every story used to be a poem for the most part. Prose is a very recent fad. So if you have a story that you wrote, what you can do is you can turn it into a poem. And if you use rhyme and meter, um, you can even make it a children's story. Uh, and that could be a cool thing to explore. Um, Another kind of entertaining poem or fun poem, cool poem, besides the story poem, is sort of like what could be thought of as the neat, cool poem, where it's just doing like a fun exploration of language and or ideas in a light, playful way. But if you do it right, it actually gets kind of philosophical in a uh, really far out way. And I think a great example of that is 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bart, very famous poem that goes, 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree, in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know, too, that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing. And it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. Of course, that's by Wallace Stevens. And I just love that poem. A lot of people love that poem because it's just so cool. It's just so neat. It's not really saying anything. Like, a lot of it is just BS, you know. But poems don't have to really say anything because they're all about language, and having fun with language is not a bad thing. In fact, it can make a great poem just to have fun with language and have fun with the ideas that language uh, is built on. That poem's just doing so many little things with numbers and, again, just little things with language. You can just play with language and build these poems. A lot of people think that poetry has to be deep, or it has to be very serious, or you have to have a real thing that you have to be saying in every line, every word. And that's BS. That's completely ridiculous. Anyone who says that doesn't understand poems like 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Um, because you can have a lot of fun with poetry. It can be really a liberating thing to write a poem essentially about nothing, and it can be a great poem. So that's the first category I would say you can group poetry into, this fun, entertaining, cool language, almost game category. Um, but the second category, why people write poetry, in my opinion, is uh, to express love or appreciation of beauty, which is to say, people love writing love poetry. Uh, the troubadours wrote exclusively love poetry for the most part. Almost every one of their poems was about this idea of courtly love, expressing their desire and their adoration of these women, a lot of whom they barely even knew. These women, these high women of the court that the troubadours were publicly singing the praises of. But there are a lot of other examples of that category, such as William Shakespeare. Um, in his sonnets, he wrote a lot of love poems, and I'd just like to read his sonnet 130 right now because it's a fun poem because it's sort of like an anti-love poetry love poem. He goes against other love poetry in a satirical way that's kind of funny. At the time, it must have been like ridiculously funny because they didn't really have the kind of comedy we have nowadays. It was a lot more subtle, as far as I can tell. Um, although Chaucer's pretty wild. Chaucer's pretty funny. Um, but anyway, Sonnet 130 by William Shakespeare. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, and yet by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So that final line is kind of confusing because belied, what does that mean? It means misrepresented, according to the footnotes in my 250 poems, a portable anthology, third edition, edited by Peter Shackle and Jack Riddle. Um, and yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she, as any woman, belied, misrepresented, with false compare. With these other poems by other love poets who say ridiculous things that he is purposefully not saying. So they would say stuff like, my mistress's eyes are like the sun, or my mistress's eyes are more brilliant than the sun. Her lips are redder than any coral. Snow is not nearly as white as her skin is, because at that time, people in Europe viewed white skin as the best kind of skin. That's why they would artificially uh, powder their skin to be white as snow. Uh, but the point is, Shakespeare is making a mockery of all that flowery, overblown, ridiculous love poetry in his own love poem, but he ends by saying, my mistress looks way better than any of these women that other poets are misrepresenting. I'm not misrepresenting her, and she looks better than all those other women that other poets misrepresent, which is again pretty funny, especially compared to all the other stuff that was being written at the time. which was not, Dave Chappelle or anybody like that. Not Saturday Night Live in the 70s and 80s, or Monty Python, that's for sure. But anyway, that's the second category I would say that you can group poems into. The third category is very similar to the second category. The second category being, of course, to express love for someone. The third category is to honor someone or to eulogize them if they're dead. It's a very, very serious category of poems. You know, kings historically would support poems in order to, or support poets in order for those poets to write poems, you know, saying how great the kings were, honoring the kings. So there are many, many, many poems like this, but of course, poets often do this free of charge. They do this because they actually care about the people that they're writing the poem about, such as Walt Whitman's "Oh Captain, My Captain." It's a very famous poem, but most of the poems I'm reading today are very famous. He wrote this, of course, about Abe Lincoln after Abe Lincoln died, uh, because Walt Whitman cared deeply about the president, as many Americans did and still do to this day. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. Excuse me. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Oh captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores are crowding, for you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells! But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Um, Again, it's a very powerful poem. Maybe I didn't read it the best. I don't really like reading things too dramatically because I find it distracts from the words and their meaning. And also, if you read things too dramatically, you just end up looking ridiculous, making a complete clown of yourself. So hopefully I didn't do that. But the point is, poems can be a great way to express grief and move through that grief, work through the grief in a way that is touching and adds meaning and veneration to the feelings you have for someone, especially if they're no longer alive. Because life is so precious and it's very fragile. Um, so poetry can be a great way to express that and just communicate the feelings of grief that we all have. Um, anyway, let's move on. So that's sort of the third, to honor or eulogize someone. You can sort of split those into two different categories, but I think of them as one category. Categories are fun, they're all artificial, but again, they're great tools to help us focus our mind, and by focusing your mind, you can obviously uh, use that mind to create new poems. Um, Focusing your thought can help you untangle knots in your thought, and sometimes those knots have poems trapped inside them. Um, so, on that note, the fourth category of how you can sort poems, I would say, is sort of to express feelings in a way that cannot be done in prose. I find that personally, there are many thoughts that I have that I can't just say. And sometimes I just have to write a poem. I can't just say them because if I just say them in simple prose and very short sentences, they lose all the feeling that I have when I think about them. And it's the feeling that gives these thoughts any meaning, much more than the crude prose bullet points uh, that I would just say without writing poetry. I think a great example of this is T.S. Eliot's poem, "The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock." Of course, also T.S. Eliot's poem, um, "The Wasteland," but that's a much longer poem, so I do not really want to read that right now. Um, Instead, I'm just going to read "The Love Song of uh, J. Alfred Prufrock," because it's a beautiful poem, and I think it's about a certain plan. I think it's about male insecurity when it comes to bedroom matters. Which, if you just say that, you know, like I just did, it seems very ignoble and it seems very crude and silly, kind of. But it's actually a major issue um, that you can only really express properly, in my opinion, and apparently in T.S. Eliot's opinion, if I'm interpreting his poem correctly, by talking about it very obscurely. And it starts with a quote by Dante from the Inferno, Canto 27, lines 61 through 66. And again, according to my footnotes, that quote, my footnotes from 250 Poems, a portable anthology, 3rd edition, edited by Peter Satchel and Jack Riddle, that epigraph roughly translates to be, "If I thought that my answer were being made to someone who would ever return to Earth, this flame would remain without further movement. But since no one has ever returned alive from this depth, if what I hear is true, I answer you without fear of infamy," which I think is an appropriate quote because what that's essentially saying is that the guy that Dante is talking to in the underworld is saying to him, "Hey, I'm going to spill the beans about this because nobody ever returns to Earth. So I can trust telling you this secret because you're not going to come back to the Earth to tell regular people what I'm telling you now." Which I think is a very clever way of Eliot winking at us, saying, there's no way you know what I'm talking about, so I can talk about it. Which again, I think is, I think he's talking about in this poem, um, male insecurity when it comes to performance beneath the sheets. Which again, if you just say that right out, it seems ridiculous. And maybe he was aware of that. He did have a devilish sense of humor, but I also think that he meant it seriously at the same time of being aware that if ever people would figure out what he was talking about, they would probably find it sort of funny. But um, again, I really do think that he meant it seriously at the same time. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. The yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes. Licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. Lingered upon the pools that stand in drains. Let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys. Slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall. beneath the music from a further room. So how should I presume? And I have known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways? And how should I presume? And I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight, down with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl? And how should I then presume? Excuse me, and should I then presume? And how should I begin? Shall I say, I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? I should have been a pair of ragged claws, scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And the afternoon, the evening, sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But then I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head, grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter. I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. And would it have been worth it, after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worth while to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all. If one, settling a pillow by her head, should say, that is not what I meant at all, that is not it at all, and would it have been worth it, after all? Would it have been worth while, after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say just what I mean, but as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen, would it have been worth while if one, settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning towards the window, should say, that is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. I grow old, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows, the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea-girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. So again, I just think that's a really lovely poem. It's probably about more things than the things I've already said it's about. Um, the more you read Eliot, the more you sort of are able to figure out what he's obliquely alluding to. He's one of those poets that really rewards coming back to. Um, yeah, so the fourth category of poetry, I would say, that you could group it into, could be to express feelings in a way that can't be done by just spitting them out in prose. And a similar category you could think of as the fifth category, you could say, is to explore your own feelings about something. Uh, and sometimes you don't really you don't really know what you think about something, but you feel like you think something about it, and you're not sure. So at that point, it might be a great time to get out a pen and paper and just start thinking in metaphors, because you might write a pretty good poem, and by writing that poem, you can actually explore your own feelings about something or someone in a way that's much more powerful than going to some psychiatrist or any sort of expensive non-cure like that. And I'll just give you a personal example. I felt a certain way about a certain someone, uh, and I wrote this poem. And by writing this poem, I realized that um, I was who I was in fact feeling a certain way about that person, a way that I did not expect that I did feel about that person. Uh, and it's called Rainstorm from a Cloudless Sky. And it goes something like this. If I can just open it. Rainstorm from a cloudless sky. Excuse me. Rainstorm from a cloudless sky. What do you do? Excuse me. What do you say when all of a sudden words cease to work like a downpour in the desert with not a cloud in sight, and you are left simply at a loss of expression, unable quite to understand what is happening, at a loss of something, and all you can feel is a stunned lack of feeling, and all of a sudden there are tears in the corners of your eyes as you realize a startling new conclusion, impossible to accept, impossible, even as you know with every atom that it is the truth. So again, when I wrote that, I had no idea what I really felt about that person, and By writing that poem, I felt something about them. And by writing that poem, I just realized in a shock what I actually thought about them. Um, so yeah, that's a great thing that you can use poetry to do. If you feel like you feel something about someone or something, you should just get a pen and start exploring metaphors for how you feel about that person or thing. And you could come to a shocking realization about the true nature of your feelings. It's a great practical use for poetry, and it can make for a good poem. I'm not saying that my poem's good, although I think it is, but opinions can differ, I do suppose. A sixth reason people write poetry is to propagandize and manipulate people's feelings. I personally do not care for that sort of poetry, um, but it's a very common form of poetry. You see it almost anywhere you see poems written in popular magazines. They're always written from a particular political point of view nowadays, and they're always done with the express intention of these people who think that poetry will change people's opinions. It's ridiculous. Or they think that they'll get a lot of brownie points for writing poetry that people in power agree with. And again, I just think it's the tackiest thing ever. And it usually leads to bad poems. Those poems that are published in popular magazines, supported by the people with all the power, are usually garbage. But again, that's a very popular form of poetry, especially nowadays. But again, that's always been the case. That's sort of the similar thing about writing poems to honor kings in exchange for their patronage. But in my opinion, it's much worse because, at least with kings, there was a certain sense of nobility and a certain sense of finer things. When you're just writing poems about political issues, it's like you're writing poems about the dog's waste. I mean, it's the lowest form of garbage. Political opinions are the lowest form of garbage, but it's a very popular form of poetry nowadays. I saw another video about poetry on YouTube that stated that the number one, or that the only reason people, or the only reason poetry has to exist, the only purpose of poetry, and it's ridiculous for poetry to have a purpose, but it's beside the point. This person claimed that the only purpose of poetry was to change people's opinions. Basically, this person thinks that the purpose of poetry is to brainwash people, which to me is just insane. That definition of poetry has nothing to do with beauty, which I think that the real definition of poetry is beauty realized through language and through the sound of language. But that's just me. What do I know? And I guess a last category you can put poems in is the philosophical poem. These are very hard to do correctly, very hard to do in a way that isn't ridiculous. Um, but many have done it in a way that isn't ridiculous, um, quite famously. Uh, this is sort of similar to my fourth category, which is, of course, to express feelings in a way that can't be done in prose, but it's a lot more highbrow, a lot more highfalutin, and Again, if you do it right, it can be very, very amazing. I would put The Wasteland in this category, although again, that can almost be in category 4. These categories are all arbitrary. You can put one poem in multiple categories if you think about it, if you can justify it. Um, Again, these categories are just tools that you can use, hopefully, to inspire you to write your own poems. That's what tools should do. They should help you do work. Um, I find that tools, when employed correctly, again, help us do work. When you just have a mass of poems, uh, and you can't look at them in terms of categories, then you might be a little bit lost, and you might not know how to proceed writing your own poetry. Because poetry is fun. That's why I use the first category as fun or entertaining poems. Because to me, that's what poetry is. It's fun. Um, and that's the number one reason I write poems. Number one reason I read poems too is fun. But philosophy can be fun too, so it's important to keep that in mind as a category of poem. Some people would say that all poets must be philosophers, and I would say that a lot of poets could be considered philosophers, and a well-rounded poet must have a little bit of a philosopher in their mind. In the heart of every comedian, a little philosopher is sleeping, and I think that the same is true with poets. But I would say that at the heart of every poet, a little philosopher is just waking up. Um, and sometimes they're fully awake. But again, you got to be careful with writing philosophy poems because they can age very quickly. And once you learn more, you might look back at your old philosophy poems and think, oh man, that is really full of it. But I'll just read maybe one good one. I think that I love Walt Whitman. I think that he's a great example of a non-pretentious sort of poet philosopher that really does stand out to the test of time. A lot of people dislike Walt Whitman or they love him. And at first I hated Walt Whitman, but I've grown to really appreciate his stuff. And I don't really love it like some people do, but I think it's got a lot of merit to it. And just like Eliot, it really rewards you for continued devotion, if you will. Um, and it has a natural rhythm and a musical rhythm that I think is undeniable. And this is from Song of Myself. I do believe that this is the first canto, or the first, I don't know what you call those, the first numbered stanza, I guess. Um, Although I'm not really sure how you number a lot of his collections. But anyway, I'm just going to read it. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loathe and invite my soul. I lean and loathe at my ease. Ah, excuse me, let me read this again. I'm doing a terrible job. Let me just start with Canto 2, or Stanza 2, because I don't know. Canto 1 is a little bit Gnostic, which I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not a big fan of Gnosticism. 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 I'm not really in favor of that at all. But anyway, the slight Gnostic influence aside, I'm gonna power through and read stanza 2. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. The smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzz, whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks, and of hay in the barn, the sound of the belched words of my voice loosed to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag, the delight alone, or in the rush of the streets, or along the fields and hillsides, the feeling of health, the full noon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectres in books. You shall not look through the eyes of me either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Again, this sort of poetry can be a little bit pretentious. Of course, a lot of poetry can be a little bit pretentious, but I think that that's pretty good. Slight pretentiousness notwithstanding, slight Gnosticism notwithstanding. So yeah, those are 7 categories I would say that all poetry can be grouped into. If I'm forgetting a category, please leave me a comment. I would love to get input in this grouping system that I've come up with um, completely anecdotally from reading poetry and writing it myself. And again, I think that if you group things, you can come up with a roadmap for making more of those things. Yeah, that's why that this is somewhat useful. So number one, poetry that's fun, entertaining, or cool, such as story poems or poems like 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Number two, love poem, love poetry or poetry that appreciates beauty, um, such as a lot of nature poetry. I guess that's a subcategory I didn't even talk about. But I would group that in with love poetry because they're both about beauty and how much you love things. And number three is to honor someone or to eulogize them if they're dead. Again, those are slightly different things, but I think that they're so related you put them in one category. But if you want to, you can think of those as two separate categories. Number four is to express feelings in a way that can't be done in prose. Or if it is done in prose, it doesn't accurately really even represent those things. Um, and I think that's a very important thing to think about when it comes to poetry. And number five is similar to number four, but it's to explore complex feelings that a poet feels about something without even understanding what those feelings are fully before they even write the poem. That's sort of like a category that is for poets only. Um, but again, just like number four, I think that's a very important category to keep in mind because, again, I don't think that either of those categories are obvious uh, to people that are just on the street. Maybe they read one or two poems in grade school. Maybe they read Dr. Seuss, who's great. I love Dr. Seuss, one of the greatest poets of all time, and a great example of fun, entertaining poetry. And number six is to propagandize and manipulate people's feelings. Again, I don't really like that sort of reason for writing a poem, but it's very popular. Every time some current thing comes up, you get a million, Hallmark dishwater wannabe Emily Dickens, Emily Dickinsons, wannabe Maya Angelou's, wannabe Robert Frost's, wannabe Longfellows coming out of the woodwork, writing what the power says they should write, with a few poetic dashes thrown here and there. And in my opinion, it's not even poetry, but there's mentioning at least. And number seven is to plume the deep truths about human existence and existence in general, and explore the depths of everything. Again, in my opinion, the hardest form of poetry to attempt. But yeah, hopefully this video has been useful or helpful in some way. Uh, if you made it this far, which probably very few, if any, have. But if you have made it this far, for extra credit, I would like you to write a poem from the perspective of a factory. Maybe it's a factory that makes soda. Maybe it's a factory that makes soap, or maybe it's a factory that makes cars. It could be a fully self-automated factory, or it could be a factory with factory workers, or a mix of both. And as a added caveat, I want it to be highly formal and with or without rhymes. Highly formal and somewhat repetitive because it's about a factory, and that's what factories are. They're highly formal and repetitive. Um, Please post those in the comments. I would really enjoy reading those, and hopefully at least one person made it this far uh, into the video. Um, yeah, I've been GMH Thompson, and keep it poetic or something. I don't really have a very good catchphrase. Keep liking words. Yeah. Yeah.